Hi, my name is Emma, aka Midsummerknits Dream, and welcome back to my channel. In today's video, I'm going to be talking a little bit about what it's like to be a fiber arts influencer and what that sort of experience is like working with brands. This is related to a reel that I posted a while back on my Instagram, talking about how a lot of brands don't really pay fiber arts influencers to work with them, and how I hadn't gotten paid for any collabs in 2022. If you haven't seen that reel, I will link to it down below so you guys know what I'm talking about. But it is not really required watching for this video. I think this video can be sort of a standalone piece of content. That being said, I do also have a special guest with me today, so Emma can introduce herself.
Hello, my name is Emma, also known as Made in the Moment.
So without further ado, let's get into our conversation.
So I feel like a little bit of background on all of this. I started posting videos about how craft influencers are not really getting paid as much or at all, especially compared to people like other influencers in other fields with similar follower counts and things like that. And a lot of people were shocked about this, which kind of surprised me. I don't know, everyone was like, oh my god, you're not getting paid for these posts. So I think the standard at this point is just a lot of crafting companies will send yarn in exchange for some or a lot of content, and the kind of pushback that they're getting and sort of what we're talking about here is that it would really be great if they would also pay actual money for content. And before we really get into this too much, I do want to just straight away say that content creation and being a craft influencer is not the hardest job in the world at all. It's probably one of the easier jobs that I've ever done. And putting all of this in context, I think it's good for us to acknowledge that we know there are harder jobs that people are doing that they're not getting paid for their labor either. So this isn't to invalidate or complain about oh my god, this job is so hard, we need to be making money. But just to kind of say that it is a job, and at the end of the day we should make some money for what we're doing.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think the thing from my side is obviously, like you mentioned, this is not some significant amount of work for the most part to be posting about yarn and posting about these yarn brands. But it's just a comparison of seeing what companies are willing to pay other influencers with a similar following, and knowing that a lot of yarn or fiber arts brands could sort of afford to pay that amount as well. And I'm realizing it's not really fair.
Yeah, and what, for you, what was the point where you kind of realized that other people were being compensated more for kind of doing the same thing that fiber artists are?
So I do want to preface this by saying that my knitting account is relatively new. I started it February of last year, so it's only been around for a little over a year. So I feel for me to be sitting here asking brands to pay me is it feels like I'm asking for a lot. But at the same time, I have grown my audience a good bit in that time. But just being a newer account, I feel I didn't really expect brands to pay me or even to work with me for quite a while. And then only when this year started was when I started reaching out to brands more and trying to get these sort of opportunities. But definitely I feel I've known from the start that influencers are being paid a lot more. I've seen a lot of TikToks of people being what I made in a year every single month. And just seeing that they're making thousands of dollars from doing these brand deals, I feel I was always somewhat aware of it. I also found this website, which I've posted about on Instagram a little bit. It's called F You Pay Me. And it's a website where influencers can share how much they're making from collabs and then see what other people are making as well and sort of what their experiences are. So I joined that this year as well and just was amazed by seeing people with similar following counts to me just making so much more money from working with these brands. So I feel that really opened my eyes to sort of what we should be getting paid in these situations. But yeah, what about you?
Yeah, I think for me, it was sort of similar. My account is, I guess, a little bit older than yours, but still for the longest time, I had this huge imposter syndrome of well, even though I have this many followers, they don't need to pay me because I don't really know what I'm doing. I'll do it for free. I want the free yarn. That's good enough for me. And then I have a couple friends who are sort of in the fashion influencer side of things, or they're thrift flip fashion influencers. And when I started getting brand deals, the first time a brand reached out to me and gave me like a number offering to pay, I was like, oh my God, they're like paying me actual money. And I went to my friends and asked them like, hey, is this a reasonable amount? And they basically said like, that's pretty low actually. And that brand is like known for paying fairly low, but like I would take it and see if you can get a little bit more. But it's been nice to have a sort of network of people who are also trying this out, and to be able to sort of reference like, okay, they have this many followers, they have this much experience doing this, and like here's where I sit with that. So yeah, I should be charging X amount for this kind of content, whatever. But I think after doing that first paid brand deal where I was like, you know, just excited to get any money at all, I started realizing like I can set my rates a little bit higher, and if the brand wants to say no, they can. And I get ghosted a lot by brands, and that's fine. But I do still think that I charge way lower compared to other accounts of the same following size as mine, just because there is not this precedent for like really high paid brand deals for the most part as like craft influencers.
Yeah, so 2 related questions to that, actually. My first question is, I know you've done a couple of brand deals with sort of non-fiber arts related brands, non-yarn companies. So I'm curious to get your thoughts on that. Like, do you feel like that is sort of a good deal? And do you feel like posting about non-fiber arts related brands would sort of alienate your audience? Or do you have any like follow-up thoughts on that?
Yeah, I actually do have a lot of thoughts on this. And I think the brands that I choose to partner with, I am like strategic about, in the sense that like I have to find a link somehow to either fiber arts or like to me personally. So like I did a brand deal with Parade, and to me that's like close enough to fiber arts because I'm wearing the pieces and I can combine that with like a piece that I made, you know, like, oh, I'm wearing this under this, or I'm wearing like this paired with this. Or like I haven't gotten a brand deal for my hair yet, but like I would do something like that, you know, because I get a lot of comments about it. So it's like something that people are interested in. And I feel like, to me, like connecting it with something that like I would actually use in my real life, like outside of the internet, and something that I think people would be interested in hearing me talk about or recommend, or possibly would have like questions about it if I used that brand like on my own without having a brand deal. But I don't know, maybe some people don't like that. Maybe some people just want to like only have the craft products recommended, and that's totally fair too. But I think for me, that's sort of how I like justify it, I guess, to myself, of like, this makes sense to me. It makes sense theoretically, like for my audience to be interested in this. And like with all brand deals, like they can choose to watch it and engage or not, you know? And that's the nature of that. But I do tend to be pretty picky with what brands I work with as well, because of like, you know, sustainability being important to me, and like ethics and things like that. Do you have any thoughts about that? About like if like craft influencers or accounts like should just stick to kind of crafting collabs or expand out?
Yeah, I think it's tricky, because if I could stick to just crafting or fiber arts related collabs, I think I would choose to for the most part. If that was more sort of a well-paying way to do brand partnerships, then I think I would probably for the most part, or maybe completely, just stick to doing fiber arts related collabs. But because that industry seems to be very far behind and sort of not willing to pay us sort of knit influencers or fiber arts influencers for our work, I feel like that's why a lot of us have sort of turned towards doing more kind of unrelated collabs. I do have other interests other than just fiber arts. Like I'm interested in makeup, I'm interested in clothing to some extent, and so like I feel like those collabs could make sense for me, but because my account is like very heavily focused on mainly just fiber arts, I feel like I would choose to stick to those if I could. And I also do wonder if like my audience would be alienated if I did a lot of these sort of non-fiber arts related collabs. So definitely it's kind of like a tricky line to balance there. I definitely don't have too much experience in this area yet, but we'll see going forward if I decide to sort of do more or stick with not doing too many. My other related question for you also was, I also posted a reel similar to yours, very much inspired by yours, talking about how, fiber arts companies don't really pay for collabs and how I hadn't gotten paid for any collabs last year. And I got an interesting comment on that post saying that people don't really look to fiber arts influencers for, influencing them as much. Like people don't have as much of a personal connection with these influencers versus maybe influencers in other niches. And so that's the reason that, yarn brands or fiber arts brands aren't really willing to pay as much. So I was really interested to get your thoughts on this, if you think this is sort of a valid comment or not as much.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting thing for someone to comment. Because I have a feeling it varies so much between like different accounts, because some people share more like personal stuff alongside their creation and some people like really only share what they're making. But I would say like at the very least, whether you have a connection with someone or not, if you're looking to them as inspiration for your projects or you're following them, I think the products that they use are to some extent like going to influence you. Whether it's only like by brand recognition or not, I think that like there is a degree of influence. And we see this in like, there's a couple yarn companies that have like done a lot of influencer marketing where they've sent out like PR packages to people, or they have like done work with influencers and like really focused on content creation around their yarn. And I would argue that like that's the reason why a lot of people buy yarn from those companies. Obviously a company like Michael's or Joann's or Lion Brand or something like that, they already have the name recognition out there because they are just such a big company. But for smaller brands, like I don't think you could argue that like their success is completely separate from what kinds of people are using their yarn. So I guess I could see the argument that like maybe people don't have the same connection to fiber arts accounts, but at the same time, like I don't know if that's the only thing that it takes for someone to want to purchase a product that they see someone else use. What are your thoughts on that topic?
I do agree with you. I also think that just reading that comment, I had a sort of visceral response of like not agreeing with it, just because I feel like I have as much of, if not more of a personal connection with a lot of the fiber arts influencers I follow. That being said, I feel like if anything, maybe people are less sort of influenced to buy a yarn immediately after seeing a fiber arts influencer use it, as compared to, I feel like if you see a makeup influencer you really like using a product or like wearing a specific shirt that you really like, it's so much easier to go out there and just buy it immediately and not have to put any work into that. Whereas for fiber arts, I feel like people want to put a little bit more research into like the kinds of yarn that they're buying, because obviously they're going to be spending so much time actually using the yarn and they want to make sure that it's the right choice for them. So I feel like when it comes to influencing people to sort of buy yarns or try out different brands, it is going to take a little bit more from our side. So I feel like there is some validity in that comment, but I don't want it to be true, I suppose. And yeah, I do agree that there's a lot of sort of brand recognition and definitely sort of not immediate influencing where someone's going to go out and buy a product right away maybe, but just starting to learn about the brand and starting to get more interest in it.
It's just like such an interesting thing for someone to comment, because it's not something that I really considered as like a factor in why people would think that like crafting influencers shouldn't get paid, because I don't know, if a brand is choosing to do influencer marketing, like clearly they think it's valuable enough for them to be putting that out there. So it's kind of like, they do the research, and if they pay the money for the campaign and they don't get a return on their investment, then they're not going to do it again, kind of thing. But I think the main thing is that like we haven't really seen companies do that on a large scale, so we don't know sort of where that what happens with that. Something that I've seen a few people comment on, like on a few of the TikToks and Reels that I've posted, is the idea that because crafting is a hobby, that we should just be happy that we get free yarn and that we shouldn't get paid for it. And I don't know really like why this is such a prevalent argument, and I feel like this kind of comes up with pattern testing too, and like the question of like, should we pay pattern testers for like the work that they're doing, or is the work that they're doing something that they love doing and so they shouldn't get paid for it? What are your, like, where do you land on this spectrum of like, it's a hobby, I shouldn't get paid, and like, it's work, I should be paid for the work that I do?
I definitely don't agree that we shouldn't get paid just because it's a hobby. I feel like I've been leaning a lot on the example of some other influencers in different spaces, but I do want to just keep going back to it because it's the best example that we have. Like, just looking at a lot of influencers who started out, they almost always are going to start out as a hobby, especially because like 10 years back, influencing for money wasn't even really a thing. Like, people were just posting YouTube videos for fun. So in a similar way, I feel like even though we can start out, knitting or crocheting as a hobby, once we gain this following and have, an influence, I feel like at that point, working with brands, like, we are entitled to get paid because we are providing some benefit to them. And I would also understand this argument a little bit more if it was just talking about, designers for test knitting, or yarn brands that are really, really small yarn brands, like just run by one person, and talking about the fact that, these people can't necessarily afford to pay, which is totally a valid point. But when it comes to some of these bigger yarn brands, they definitely can afford to pay for influencer marketing and working with these influencers. So when it comes to sort of smaller brands, I definitely do understand that maybe they're not going to be able to pay, and I'm still, willing to look into possibilities and work with those brands. But when it comes to bigger brands that are trying to get away with not paying influencers, especially if they're asking for sort of a lot of content in return for free yarn, I just feel like it is not worth it. And just because it's a hobby doesn't mean we should be willing to do things for free. Yeah, that's sort of my take. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. And I would kind of be interested to know like what kinds of people are commenting this, like, but the bottom line is that, like, you're right, it might start out as a hobby and it can stay as a hobby, but also a part of the hobby can also be work. Like, I make a lot of things just because I like doing it, and I'm not necessarily monetizing every single thing that I make, but if I am making content or making a piece for a brand or something like that, then that part of the hobby is work and it should be paid. It's the same thing with any kind of art. Like, you would never argue that like a painter shouldn't be paid for their work because it's a hobby and they like it. That feels ridiculous to me. So I think it's the same thing with fiber arts and crafts in any space. And something else that I've been thinking about is just the how fiber arts is such like a female-dominated space and craft, and I think that it's even more important for us to like stand up for ourselves and say like, no, we deserve to be paid for the work that we're doing, because women are historically like underpaid or not paid for labor. Yes,
I absolutely agree with that. Okay, I wanted to circle back quickly to a point that you mentioned as well. You mentioned how with these sort of partnerships, we're often being requested to actually make a piece for a brand. And I just wanted to bring that up because I was talking to one of my designer friends on Instagram about this actually, and she mentioned that she really doesn't take any of these sort of partnerships with yarn brands because they require, in addition to just, posting about the brand, a lot of times they require actually making a whole entire knitted or crocheted piece, like a sweater, to actually show how that yarn works up. So I feel like in this way, it's even harder to sort of take these unpaid partnerships because you are putting so many hours of labor into making a sweater or making a knitted piece. And obviously, like we've mentioned before, this is also part of our hobby. So, we have fun making a sweater or making whatever piece we're making. But I feel like it still is part of the labor that we're doing for this sort of campaign. So it's just interesting for me to think about the fact that we have to put so much more work into these partnerships and these campaigns by actually knitting or crocheting something. So I wanted to get your thoughts around that. Like, what do you think about having to actually do the labor of making something?
Yeah, I'm kind of on the same page as your friend about this, where, when I was starting out and just trying to trying to figure out how all of this worked, I would take a couple of those where I was like, well, I'm gonna make this anyway. I'll get the yarn for free and then make my project with it. But having like a time constraint on a project or having like expectations that the brand wants, it was just like way too much pressure. And so now the only yarn partnerships that I do are where like the only requirement is like just showing the yarn, or like maybe a swatch. Like I'll knit a swatch for a brand deal, you know? And if I finish a project with the yarn, then of course, like I will also post about that. But having it as a requirement is it's just too much, especially if they want like a whole sweater. That's a huge project, a huge time commitment. And there's a precedent for people being paid to knit pieces to show off yarn. Like in local yarn stores, if they reach out to a knitter and say, hey, can you knit this pattern with this yarn? And we'll pay you for it. That's like you're knitting a sample for the store to use. And you can set your rate based on like whether they are keeping the piece forever or they're just kind of renting it out and then they'll give it back to you. But like that's already a part of the knitting community like in real life. And I think at the very least, like brands who are wanting you to create a finished object to show off their yarn, there should be some kind of extra fee in there for the process of actually making it. And of course it's not going to cover your time or anything, and sample knitting fees like rarely do. It's kind of just like a little bonus for making the piece. But it's a huge part of it, because it's not just making the content, you also have to make a whole piece in addition to it, and that's like when it starts to really add up and become not worth it time-wise. So yeah, I completely agree with that.
Yeah, definitely. After having these sort of conversations, I think going forward for any yarn or fiber arts partnerships, I definitely will not be including the knitting of anything within that. Or if I do, I'll really up the fee, because you're right, it just doesn't seem worth it.
Yeah, and I there are brands that like do want to partner with you on a pattern, you know, where they send you the yarn, you write a pattern, and then there's kind of a back and forth with that. But I think you do, like you said, you have to be really aware of the time that that's going to take you and price everything accordingly, and then like really up the price for that because you are creating something extra for it. Oh, I do have a little question for you. I think it would be interesting to add a little bit of context about like what other work both of us do in terms of like, do you have a day job? Like what do you do right now that pays the bills? Is it fiber arts? Do you want it to be fiber arts? Is this just a side thing? Do you want this to be a full-time thing? Like all of that. Tell me about like your work and your work experience.
So I am a software engineer as my day job, which is, I've mentioned this in a TikTok or a reel before. It's a very like analytical sort of job. I'm doing a lot of coding on a day-to-day basis. It's very, very different from the work that I sort of do with fiber arts and YouTube and all of this sort of separate universe. And in terms of monetizing my sort of fiber arts experiences, and if I would want this to be a full-time thing going forward, I do think yes, it would be really, really amazing if someday I could just quit my day job and be doing fiber arts full-time. That's something I've always had as sort of like a pipe dream, even though I feel like I'm not sure how realistic it is. But I do also sometimes question like if I would enjoy it less if I was doing it as a full-time thing. I know a lot of people have talked about this, where once you are doing a hobby as your sort of full-time job, it just becomes less enjoyable because there's so many commitments and things. And definitely like I can see that argument. I would be interested to see if I ever start doing fiber arts full-time, if I sort of derive less enjoyment from it. But definitely like if that were ever an option in the future, that would be amazing. That said, at the moment, I'm not really making any money from knitting, but I am really hoping to change that this year, so fingers crossed.
Yeah, I saw your YouTube channel just got monetized, finally.
Yeah, it's very exciting.
It is, congrats.
Thank you. Yeah, what do you do for your day job? Or you're in grad school right now, right?
Yeah, so I'm in my last semester of grad school. I have 4 weeks left, 5 weeks? I don't know, I'm so close to being done. And I'm really excited to see sort of what happens after grad school, but my degree is in vocal pedagogy and opera performance. So vocal pedagogy is like voice science and teaching singing, basically. That's what I always say as like the condensed version. So right now I'm doing some like voice science research and teaching lessons, voice lessons, to some private students through the school and then like outside of school. So that is kind of one chunk of my time and like where a little bit of money comes from teaching. And then I also will occasionally do some like singing things. So I'll like sub at churches. So I'll go and sing for the morning and then I get paid my fee for that. So that's like another little chunk of the pie. And then my main thing actually is all of the things associated with fiber arts and Made in the Moment, which is like a lot of it is pattern sales and then also like YouTube and then brand deals kind of whenever they come up. So it's interesting because going into grad school, I didn't have this. Like my plan was just to get, you know, maybe a job at school or get a job as a server in the city somewhere. And then all of this kind of just like happened. And I would say, like, to your point about getting burned out or, you know, losing interest or getting stressed out about whatever your full-time thing is, part of me feels like that with all of this and having fiber arts be my main thing. But then the other part of me is like, I don't feel like that at all, and this is so fun, and I still love making things and doing things. And honestly, I think the hardest part is just balancing this with like also being in a very academically rigorous school environment. So yeah, that's sort of what I do. So it's like lots of different things that all come together and keep me entertained. But yeah, that's part of the reason why I think this conversation is important, because like I don't have a full-time, I don't have a 9-to-5 to sort of fall back on. And if I'm doing work, I feel like I should be getting money so that I can like, you know, pay off my student loans or like pay my rent or things like that, because I can't do all of that just with yarn.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you mentioned in one of your videos you're planning to do Made in the Moment sort of full-time after you graduate, or are you going to continue doing sort of like singing stuff on the side? Like, how is that going to work?
Yeah, so it'll sort of depend on a lot of things, but my plan is to do Made in the Moment full-time, but then also probably teach voice lessons and do some auditions for gigs sort of around. So I feel like I am going to do like a full-time thing plus whatever extra. And we'll see sort of how the balance ends up with both of those, but I'm trying not to like make too many plans for the future, because I don't really know what things are going to look like once I actually have time open up for that. But yes, I want to do everything that I like doing.
That's exciting. That's super exciting. Related question, if you are open to talking about this, which I totally understand if you aren't, and we can just cut it out if so. Would you be open to talking about sort of your different streams of income from Made in the Moment and where you're making the most money?
Yeah. I can do a little bit of a breakdown right now. I actually recorded a Patreon podcast episode talking about this exact subject in like pretty great depth. I think it was my February episode. So if you're interested, then you can go listen to that. But the biggest stream of income I have is from pattern sales, and the most of my pattern sale kind of traffic goes through my website, which is sort of how I have designed it to be. I was really hesitant to making my own website for a while, but I've really liked having the control over like how I set it up, and the fees are much lower than a lot of other websites. And I use Shopify, which is like, I think it's $30 a month, which is not that bad. So that's the biggest one, my Shopify store. And then I also I list my patterns on Etsy, Ribbler, Ravelry, and Ko-fi, but I don't often like send traffic to those. A lot of that is just kind of like what people see on the platform when they're looking around already. And then the other thing that's like a pretty big chunk of income right now is the YouTube like ad revenue. And I know that like in the past it used to be a lot higher per view, but it's still like a pretty decent amount now, even though it's like less than it was, 10 years ago. So that's a good thing too. And that just kind of, the amount that I get depends on how much I post, obviously, and then if my videos are picked up by the algorithm or not. And that, of course, like who even knows? I feel like I don't understand at all how the YouTube algorithm works. I just kind of make stuff and I hope people like it. But that's the main thing. And then for a while I was getting money from Instagram for the like Reels play bonuses. But as far as I know, they've stopped doing that. I don't know. I think they stopped and then they're going to start again, or they're going to change it or something like that. But I am not doing that anymore because that's kind of done. And then also brand deals, like when those come up, but those are fairly inconsistent and I have no way of predicting when they're gonna happen. And then the final stream, which is like the smallest little sliver of the pie, is selling finished objects, which I don't sell that often because I feel like most people in my audience are crocheters or knitters themselves, and so they just buy my patterns and make them. But every now and then I'll be like, I have too many pieces, like I don't wear these 6 pieces and I really like them, but like I know that I will make something that I like more that will kind of take that spot. So then I'll list them on Depop or, I don't know, do a story sale or something. And usually I charge like fairly low for them because I'm not trying to like get the value of the piece, but I'm just trying to like get it to someone who will appreciate it and wear it more than I can. So yeah, all of those things. I think that's everything.
Cool. Yeah, sorry, I feel like that was kind of an unrelated question, but I was just curious to hear from your side, and I'm definitely going to watch that podcast episode. So thanks for sharing.
Oh, the last thing that I wanted to ask you is, like, have you had any positive experiences with brand deals? And if so, like, what was it about the situation that made it like a positive experience as opposed to like a negative experience? Or just like a gifted collaboration, even if it's not like a, I don't know, official brand deal.
Right, okay. Yeah, I haven't worked with that many yarn brands because, as we mentioned, it's a little difficult to get collaborations with yarn brands, at least paid ones. I'll say I've had 2 sort of positive collaborations with yarn brands. Both of which are sort of in progress, so I'm not gonna, name the brands or anything. But the first one is sort of a more up-and-coming yarn brand that I reached out to because I had seen them work with other influencers on Instagram. And I feel like it was positive because they were willing to pay me, first of all, which is always a big plus. And just, we're very friendly and kind, and we're really open to hearing my ideas, which is a big one as well. Like, I want to be able to sort of give my own ideas for content as opposed to a brand telling me what to do and sort of telling me that I have to post a certain number of things. I was really able to propose my own ideas as well as give my own rates, which was really positive for me. In retrospect, I think I definitely should have charged more because, as we previously discussed, this one's going to involve sort of knitting something with the yarn, and so I wish I had upped my rate for that. However, I feel like given what I knew at the time, it was a good experience and I'm happy to have worked with them. Another one is I worked with a sort of hand dyeing yarn company. They mentioned that they weren't really looking for more people to work with at the moment, but they sent me an affiliate link to use, and we're just super friendly. They also later on sort of sent out an opportunity where they said, if you sort of use our yarn for this specific project, then we can pay you as well. And I feel like it just, honestly, it surprised me a little bit because they are a smaller brand, but they're willing to pay sort of fiber arts influencers a significant amount for using their yarn and posting about it. So I feel like that was overall a very positive experience, and it was kind of interesting to see that these 2 almost sort of like smaller brands were willing to pay influencers, whereas a lot of the bigger brands are not. So those were both just positive experiences for me, and definitely in the future I think I'll be reaching out to more brands that I feel like align with these similar sort of values. I bet you have more experience to share though, so feel free to share from your side as well.
Well, yeah, I think it's sort of the same things for me. The same like qualities in a collaboration make it a positive experience, where like the company that I'm working with is flexible on like, even like posting dates or the content that I want to make. And obviously like that it's paid, that definitely makes it a positive experience. And just being like open to kind of a discussion of ideas of like what I can bring to the table as me, and then what ideas they have for like what product that I'm promoting. And I think the more flexible the possibilities are, the more fun it is, because then I feel like I can really make something that's actually my own, and that I'll be like excited to post, and that I feel like people will actually be more interested in, as opposed to if I'm like following a prompt too closely, because then it doesn't feel as like organic. So yeah, I think for me it's very similar qualities of like flexibility and creativity and all of it.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think if a brand has very strict requirements, I do feel like your audience can kind of catch on to that and realize that, oh, this person is just posting about this brand because, you know, they've been asked to, and like it's not really them. So I feel like definitely just working with brands that are going to be a little bit more open to you proposing ideas and you deciding what you want to make and things like that is definitely like a really big plus.
Yeah, and I think now that people are starting to talk about that, you know, and we're having this conversation now, and I feel like a lot of other people are starting to say things as well. I hope that that's kind of what brand deals look like moving forward for the fiber arts community, with the understanding like that it does take a lot of time to actually put together a project, and the more flexibility within all of that, the better.
Thanks for coming to talk to me today. I really enjoyed our conversation. And do you have anything to promote, or where can people find you?
My main things at the moment are Instagram and TikTok, but then I also post on YouTube, and I think Emma will tag all of those below, but I'm Made in the Moment on everything. I also am releasing a few new patterns soon, so if you're interested in those, then you can see my website, scroll through my Instagram and see what you like. But that's pretty much it. Thank you for having me. This was really fun.
That is it for our conversation about fiber arts, influencing, social media, working with brands, all of those fun topics. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I want to say a really big thank you to Emma, aka Made in the Moment, for being in this video. I think we really had a fun conversation, and I really enjoyed talking to her. I will link all of their socials down below if you want to check them out. You really should, because they're amazing. Otherwise, thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye!